Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Ask a Property Manager. This is episode number 78 and today is July 7th, 2021. We're coming to you from Studio 2.0 here at Own Buffalo. I'm Andrew Schultz, principal broker of Own Buffalo Inc. And on today's show, we're going to be talking about cleaning up after someone dies in your rental property, lawful sources of income. We're going to answer some questions from housing providers around the country and so much more. But before we jump into that, we are going to go ahead and plug our social media. New episodes of Ask a Property Manager every Wednesday, 10 a.m. Eastern on our Facebook page. You can also catch the replay on our YouTube as well as on our Facebook the same day. Last but not least, don't forget about our Instagram. We post things there that don't make it onto our other two platforms. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and plug the Rent Prep for Landlords podcast. Don't miss the current episode of the podcast. We're taking a look at renters applying for a property without seeing it first. We're also taking a look at how to minimize the amount of time that your property spends vacant on the market. And last but not least, we're talking about how to handle tenants that make incremental rent payments. So don't miss out on that. New episodes drop every other Thursday morning anywhere podcasts can be heard or over at rentprep.com/podcast. Let's go ahead and jump into our news of the day here, starting with this article from CNBC on mortgage servicing. Mortgage servicers brace for fallout as the COVID bailout comes to an end. This article was published on Friday, July 2nd. The nation's mortgage servicers are gearing up for the biggest wave of delinquent loans since the subprime mortgage crisis, but this time they say they are ready. The first wave of borrowers to enter the government's coronavirus mortgage bailout program are entering their last possible quarter for relief, which means that come September, they will either have to start paying, sell their homes, or go into foreclosure. Mortgage bailout programs, both government and private sector, launched at the start of the COVID pandemic. The government originally allowed borrowers to delay their monthly payments for up to a year. That was then extended to 18 months. Each quarter, borrowers must re-up. An estimated 7.25 million borrowers have participated in forbearance programs at one point or another throughout the pandemic, representing 14% of all homeowners with mortgages, according to Black Knight. About 72% of all the participants have since left their plans, while 28%, or just more than 2 million, remain in active forbearance. This week and next, a total of more than 350,000 borrowers will be reviewed for extension or removal from forbearance, according to Black Knight. Of the 146,000 plans reviewed this week, 44,000 homeowners left forbearance, while the plans of 102,000 were extended. With roughly two-thirds of the borrowers remaining in forbearance, Black Knight estimates that 575,000 plans will expire in September and the beginning of October, meaning mortgage servicers will be facing the daunting task of dealing with about 15,000 troubled loans per day. We all know what's coming, and we've invested as well, and so I think from an industry perspective, we are, especially among the larger servicers, I think we're definitely ready, said Jay Bray, CEO of Mr. Cooper, the largest non-bank mortgage servicer in the nation. At the start of the bailout, part of the CARES Act, Bray characterized the mortgage program as complete chaos, but now admits I was wrong. Bray credits the ramp-up in new technology and streamlined procedures for the plan's success. It was simple, easy. The customer experience, I think, was about as good as it could be. And then you look at the tools that when you're coming off forbearance, those are easy as well, he said. But Bray also said his company is adding staff to get ready for the onslaught and moving some staff from originations, which are currently weakening, to loss mitigation. It will be significant volume, but we are more than ready for that, said Bray. Working with all these folks and the stakeholders, I think we've got some great solutions. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and the FHA this week published new guidelines to help borrowers whose plans were expiring. Part of that includes more interest rate reduction and loan modifications to help keep borrowers in their homes. Allowing more families to qualify for an interest rate reduction will prevent unnecessary foreclosures, help strengthen the enterprise's book of business, and make sustainable homeownership a reality for more families currently living with the uncertainty of forbearance, said acting FHFA Director Sandra Thompson. Mortgage servicers in general want to keep as many borrowers in their homes as possible since the foreclosure process is very expensive. They can perform loan modifications, lowering the interest rate, and can also tack on all the missed payments to the end of the loan. While there is a so-called waterfall of options, the final one is selling the home, which in today's very pricey housing market could even net some borrowers a small profit. The CFPB also just changed its guidance for how servicers should handle borrowers when mortgage forbearance programs expire. Part of that is improving outreach from the servicers as well as helping servicers process loan modifications and not pushing for a foreclosure moratorium. We also see as improved a change that permits servicers to approve We also see as improved a change that permits servicers to approve a borrower for a modification even if they don't have all the information back from the borrower, wrote Jarrett Seelberg, financial services and housing policy analyst at Cowen Washington Research Group. The key is to quickly delivering relief. As the CFPB notes, as many as 3% of mortgage borrowers are at least 4 months behind on 4 months behind on payments. That could mean that they face foreclosure. While an improving economy should help more borrowers to become current again on their payments, no one denies that there will be foreclosures in the fall and winter, as some troubled borrowers simply have no other recourse. While it is difficult to predict how many, it will be nothing like the crisis a decade ago when more than 11 million homes entered the foreclosure process. When you look at the tools that we have today and the ease of coming off forbearance plans, I think it's just so much simpler than what we saw in the past. So this is actually a really interesting article, and there's a few things I wanted to point out here. The first of which being the number of people who participated and have come out of forbearance is actually pretty impressive. When you started with a total of 7.25 that participated at some point, with 72% having since left their plans, that's actually a really good sign for economic recovery, at least in my opinion. It's good to see that people are able to get back on track, either with a remodification or whatever the case may be, to be able to stay in their homes. That does leave the 28% or just over 2 million in active forbearance. We will see what happens with those properties. And then as we scroll down, there was another point I wanted to touch on. The different options that people had for basically staying in their homes, starting with forbearance, followed by some sort of either a modification of their existing loan, tacking the payments onto the end of their loan, something along those lines, reduction in interest rate, et cetera, et cetera. And then the one option that a lot of people have just plain forgotten about is this one right here. While you do have a ton of options, we are in one of the hottest real estate markets that we've been in for quite some time, which has caused property values to rise. If your home is still in good shape, if you're still maintaining the home and you're not planning on letting it sink into foreclosure, you may have the option of selling the property at either, maybe a profit, or at the very least, hopefully you're not selling it at a loss, such that you find yourself, being able to dig out of the situation and kind of start fresh. It's no one's favorite option. No one wants to sell their primary residence and have to start fresh, but it could be the difference between, staying on top of the game and falling even further behind. So that is something to think about. And then when we scroll down here, they start talking about the fact that there will be foreclosures. I don't think anybody's going to be shocked at that fact. There will be foreclosures as a result of this, but we're not going to see that foreclosure inventory for probably 24 to 36 months after the foreclosure moratorium ends. It takes a very, very long time to complete a foreclosure, especially here in the state of New York. You are talking between 24 and 36 months from the time that property falls into foreclosure status to the time where it's actually been foreclosed on and comes back around and on the market. And that is kind of the short end of it. I have seen some properties 5, 7, 9 years that have just been sitting there and deteriorating. As a matter of fact, I just walked by one in my neighborhood the other day that I know for a fact has been sitting there vacant for at least 3 years, because I know the crew that did the trash out on it when it went vacant. So it sucks that we're going to see a bunch of foreclosures, but I don't think that that's going to be a real shock to anybody here. I do think that these mortgage servicers are doing as much as they can to help keep people in their homes, but for some people, that's just not going to be a viable solution. Jumping into our next article here, this one comes to us via Buffalo Business First, but it does have a little bit more of a national flair to it. Office lease terms are getting longer after the wave of short-term renewals during COVID, but flexibility is still key. Most office leasing activity since the COVID-19 pandemic has been renewals and short-term extensions, as companies took a wait-and-see approach about the future of their space needs. In mid-2021, many companies are still not totally sure what their space requirements will look like with a new hybrid buzzword. The situation is improving, but we're still not back to normal, said Phil Ryan, U.S. Office Research Director at JLL. But those tracking the office industry report an uptick in longer-term deals being signed. Nationally, the average lease signed in the second quarter of 2021 had 7.4 years of term, an increase from 7.1 years in Q1 2021 and 6.7 years at the end of 2020. In Q1 2020, an average term length was 8.9 years. What they're meaning when they say term length is how long is the lease for. So what they're saying here is, Q1 2020, pre-COVID, we were seeing extensions of roughly 8.9 years on average. Probably a lot of people in the 5-year and a bunch of people in the 10-year buckets. As the year went on, obviously that went down to the point where at the end of 2020, the average extension was 6.7 years, which means that all of these companies were looking for much shorter terms while they figured out what's next. In the New York Metro, historically a market with longer leases, renewals averaged 9.9 years in 2019 compared to 6.8 in 2020 and year-to-date 7.9 according to CBRE research. Again, you can see there was, that's a substantial dip there. New deals and expansions have gotten shorter year over year, averaging 11.8 years in 2019, 11 years in 2020, and so far 10 years in 2021. Between April and December 2020, 54% of rentals in New York that were larger than 15,000 square feet had lease terms of 5 years or less. Even some large Manhattan leases signed last year, NBC Universal's 340,000 square foot renewal and Stroke and Lavern's 191 square foot deal were short term. So far in 2021, the proportion of short-term renewals in New York market has been reduced to 32%. We saw a fair amount of deals last year between the 3 to 5 years, but brokers kept saying tenants were kicking the can to 2 to 3 years down the road, said Nicole LaRusso, Director of Research and Analysis for the New York Tri-State region at CBRE. Short-term deals signed during the pandemic will create somewhat of a surge in expirations in New York as well as other cities in the coming years, especially 2023. LaRusso said by that time there's expected to be more momentum in the overall economy. In June, CBRE was tracking 90 active office tenants, each seeking 50,000 square feet or more in Manhattan. In April 2020, there were only 17 such tenants in the market, down from 133 a month prior. That's something to think about. In April 2020, there were only 17 tenants looking for 50,000 square foot or more in the tri-state region, down from 133 the previous month. That's massive when you talk about people pulling out of a search for space. It's not certain whether lease term averages will ever return to pre-pandemic levels. The market today remains tenant favorable and flexible. Including term length is the key in negotiating renewals, expansions, or new deals. Plus, LaRusso said tenants today have more of an opportunity to split their footprint among traditional leases, subleases, or spaces with a third-party operator such as a co-working space. If tenants are signing on for 10 years or longer, today they'll be frequently looking for things like rent discounts or the ability to terminate a lease early with fewer penalties. So that actually makes a lot of sense. It was kind of a weird situation at the beginning of COVID, trying to figure out, okay, obviously a lot of people went to a work from home type situation, and there was a lot of discussion at the onset of the pandemic of, oh, this is never going to come back. We're all going to be work from home forever. We have seen some companies that have basically stated that they were going to be work from home start to pull back the reins on that. For instance, I'm drawing blank on an example right now. But there were a couple of tech companies that had stated that they were planning on basically allowing people the ability to work from home. And then they were, starting to tighten the reins and pull that back. I think we had just covered an article maybe last week or the week before talking about one of the major banking institutions, Morgan Stanley maybe, basically saying if you want to work remote, we're not going to pay you a New York salary so that you can live in someplace with a much lower cost of living. Your salary is going to adjust, in comparison to where you're living. So I think we'll see some of that too. I think that you're going to see a lot of pushback on this from employees, to be completely honest with you. I think a lot of people have grown very accustomed to being able to work from home. And now that we're in this to the extent that we are into it, I think a lot of people are going to understand how to make a work from home solution work for them, such that they don't have, dogs barking and kids screaming in the background and stuff like that. So it'll be interesting to see where we ultimately wind up. I do think there will be a lot more people that make the move back to work at the office, but I don't think it'll ever go back to 100%. So just something to think about. Let's go ahead and take a look at something funny for a change here. Enough of the news of the day, if you will. I think I picked this one up on Facebook, and honestly, if I could find a plumber that would do something like that, I would certainly get a kick out of it. I really got to laugh at that one. Let's take a look at this one. This one comes back from the Horrible Bathrooms collection. I don't understand what people are thinking when they rehab their bathrooms, but honestly, it's kind of terrifying sometimes. All right, let's go ahead and jump into our questions from housing providers around the country here, starting with this one on lawful source of income. Do I need to count unemployment as income? It runs out before the end of the lease, and they won't get their old job back since they are moving out of the area to my area. I didn't make myself clear. This is for a prospective tenant in California. I'm trying to figure out if they have 3 times the rent in income. So in New York State, we do have to count unemployment income as it is considered a lawful source of income. Lawful source of income became protected as part of HSTPA back in June of 2019. So there is a struggle here because you know that there's a defined amount of time that they're going to have that income, and it's certainly going to be less than the length of your lease term. The best thing that you can do here is have written criteria and state that your income requirement is 3 times the rent net income, after-tax income. Most people are going to be able to make that requirement work and qualify for the apartment. So that's something to keep in mind. Have a good set of written criteria and use something like 3 times the rent net income as your income qualifier, because you can have an income requirement, you just have to count all lawful sources of income. So that would include things like disability or Section 8 vouchers or unemployment, things like that. Retirement income, standard employment income, self-employment income, all valid lawful sources of income. That's what you should be looking at, is what is a lawful source of income. And here in New York State, they do require you to count unemployment as a lawful source of income. So as I mentioned, it does create that struggle of what do you do, because this person is, they have income right now, but they're not going to have income for the full duration of the lease. Couple of options. You might want to require a cosigner, and if you're going to require a cosigner, their income should be 4.5 times the rent in income, in net income. And the reason I say that is because they have to be able to cover not only all of their own expenses, but also need to be able to cover this rent in the event that this tenant defaults. So you want to make sure that they have sufficient income in order to be able to do all of that. So in New York State, you're now only allowed to collect first month's rent and security deposit. So you can't even do like a prepaid rent or a higher security deposit to offset your risk here. Excuse me. Something that I had thought about, and this is something that you would want to run past an attorney before you put something like this in place, would be possibly limit the term of the lease to the extent that you know what their income situation is going to be. For instance, if they have unemployment and it meets that 3 times the rent requirement, but you know that they're looking to start renting in August and their income is going to run out in February, for instance, can you run that lease from August to February and then require that tenant to requalify or move at the end of that lease term? That might be something that's valid as an option, but you would certainly want to talk to an attorney about that before putting something like that in place. And I have a feeling that that's one of those things that it might work in some states, but not in other states. So it is an idea, but it's something that you're definitely going to want to talk to an attorney about before you make a decision to go that route. Ultimately, this is one of those laws that was not completely thought through before it was implemented, and creates a very unique burden on people who are actually operating rental property. My strongest advice would be petition your politicians and ask them to clarify these laws, because clarification would go so much further than just blanket laws that leave way too much open for interpretation. And eventually, somebody becomes a canary in the coal mine when you get sued for something like this, and then a legislator decides, okay, well, I'm going to interpret the law this way, and then everybody starts to fall in line with the interpretations. Petition your politicians for clarity on stuff like this before we get to the point where somebody has to become the canary in the coal mine. Take a look at our next question, handling a hazmat cleaning. I'm trying to get decomposition, dead body smell out of a concrete floor. We decided to pull up the tile, clean and treat the concrete, and retile. My question is, what should I use to seal up the concrete, keeping in mind that I lay tile on this product? I used Zinsser bin on the walls and ceilings with a fair bit of success. It claims to be appropriate for concrete, but will the thin set or mastic stick to the bin? Other options are a water barrier like RedGuard or Hydroban, which will obviously work with the concrete and the tile, but I'm not sure if they are as good with odor. So this is one of those situations where this is not a time to scrimp and save. Bring in a remediation company that deals with this type of work. There are a ton of them out there around the country, and they're going to have the tools, and more importantly, they're going to have the chemicals to deal with this situation correctly. We have had people pass away in our apartments, and yes, it creates a really nasty situation that you have to clean up. It is a hazmat situation. It's hazardous materials that you're cleaning up, and you should use an appropriate crew to do this cleaning. This is not one of those places where you want to skimp out, as I stated earlier. This is one of those situations where your insurance would likely cover you for having all of this work done as well. So I would say talk to your insurance company, find out if they're willing to pick up the tab on this, bring in a professional remediation company to remediate the situation, and then do whatever you need to do to rebuild the space. But working a homebrew solution for something like this, it's just going to cost you more money, and it's just going to cost you more time in the long run. Do it once, do it right, bring in a professional to deal with this situation. On to our next question, prorating damages. I have a tenant who is leaving. When I was showing the apartment, I saw that the carpet on the stairs had 5 holes in it. Now I have to replace the carpet. Her cats definitely did it. So my question is it an older rug? And it is an older rug, and I can't charge for a new rug. What would be fair to charge? So the proper thing to do in this instance would be to depreciate the value of the asset based on how long it's been in place, and then determine the value from there. So if you have a carpet that was installed and it cost you $1,000, let's say the carpet is worth has a lifespan of 8 years, and we're going to look at a chart here in just a second. So if you have actually, you know what? Let me go ahead. Can I bring that chart up while I'm talking here so you guys can? There we go. So there's a ton of different charts out there as to how long something should last in a home. You can Google them and find a ton of them. I believe the IRS has one. This one is from the International Association of Certified Home Inspectors. I'm just going to go ahead and type carpet here. So flooring life is dependent on maintenance and the amount of foot traffic a floor endures, blah, blah, blah. Carpet should last you a total of 8 to 10 years. So let's say you have $1,000 worth of carpet that was installed and it has an 8-year lifespan. That means that that carpet depreciates at a rate of $125 a year. If you have a tenant that moves in year 3, you essentially have, $625 left in non-depreciated value on that carpet because the carpet is already 3 years old when that tenant moves in. If that tenant turns around and moves out in year 5 and the carpet's destroyed, you've got stains, rips, runs, whatever the case, at the end of their tenancy, because they're moving out in year 5, the carpet now has a non-depreciated value of $375, and that's what you would want to charge against the tenant security deposit at that point. So let me switch back to the question screen here. That's basically what I would do. Essentially, what you're going to do is take the full value of the carpet, depreciate it, figure out what your depreciation is over the number of years. So in this instance, it was $1,000 for the total value of the carpet divided by the 8 years. That's your $125 a year. And then from there, you can figure out, okay, there were X number of years prior to that tenant. Then that tenant was there for X number of years. I think we used 3 years and then 2 more years. So they moved out in year 5, which essentially means that the carpet had about half of its useful life left. And at that point, you would be able to depreciate based on the remaining lifespan of that carpet. So that's how we would handle something like that here in our office. And let's take a look at our last question, handling pet violations. So I just drove by one of my houses, and what do I see? My tenant outside with a dog. My lease specifically states no pets. They won't answer the phone or my text messages. What form can I send them? I'm tempted to end their lease. So you're jumping the gun a little bit. Start by sending a lease violation letter, and that's going to be dependent on how it needs to be handled in your state. Different states have different letters. Different states have different time requirements as to how long you have to give someone to cure a lease violation, things of that nature. So you're going to want to do a little research on whatever your state laws are regarding how to actually issue a lease violation. Once you have that figured out, send a lease violation and make sure that the tenant is aware of, number 1, what the violation is, number 2, how long they have to remedy the violation. That's basically the 2 points that and number 3, what are the consequences if they don't? Those are the 3 things that you really need to cover in the letter. I recommend including a copy of the relevant section from their lease. I also recommend including a photo of the violation if you have it. So if you were able to get a picture of the tenant outside with the dog, that would probably go a long way in helping you to argue, hey, you are in violation of your lease. It definitely makes it much harder to argue the point when you have photographic evidence that you hand to the tenant along with the violation letter showing them that they're in violation. Something like this with the animal being outside, it'll be interesting to see what the tenant's response is. It wouldn't surprise me if the tenant turns around and hands you some ESA paperwork or something like that. But that's the proper way to handle the situation. Find out how long you have to give the tenant to remedy the situation. issue the notice as appropriate, and then go from there. If the tenant does not remedy the situation, figure out what your next steps are, whether it's an eviction or whatever the case may be. So that pretty much wraps things up for this week's episode of Ask a Property Manager. Thank you all so much for joining us. I truly do appreciate it. I love producing Ask a Property Manager, and you guys can help us to improve by dropping a question in the comments either on Facebook or on YouTube, and your question may be picked up in an upcoming episode. If you enjoyed this content, or if I brought some value to your day, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up button. YouTube and Facebook both push videos based on community feedback, so every like, comment, subscribe, and share helps us to grow and reach more people. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode on Wednesday, July 14th at 10 a.m. Eastern. We'll be back with another show you won't want to miss. Be sure to tune in then, and we'll talk to you soon.